Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is the Federal Minister of Indigenous Services, Patty Hajdu. Hajdu was first elected as the Member of Parliament for Thunder Bay Superior North in 2015. She has held a number of cabinet positions in the Trudeau government, including Minister of Health. Prior to entering politics, Hajdu was the Executive Director of Shelter House in Thunder Bay. Minister Hajdu, great to have you with us on the show and in our Ottawa studio.
Great to be here, Dennis.
Well, let's start with the upcoming federal budget, as one is on the way. And you were recently speaking about the need for funding for housing. You were quoted as saying housing is approaching a state of crisis. And I think many would say it might have reached that point some time ago. But what are you hearing and seeing when it comes to housing?
Well, Dennis, what I'm hearing from community members and from chiefs and council all across the country is just the dire need for housing, both new housing to accommodate growing populations and crowded situations, but also for repairs and renovations of existing units. And indeed, if it's not the first thing that I'm hearing from chiefs and councils, it's for sure the second thing. And, you know, of course, with housing being a critical social determinant of health, community leaders are very well aware of the links between housing and the ability to protect residents from things like spreading COVID-19 or even tuberculosis and other illnesses. But not only that, the connection between good housing, decent housing, and mental health and educational outcomes. So it's a foundational component of a healthy community, and I've been hearing about this across the country, certainly amplifying that to my colleagues.
Certainly something we heard a lot of during this pandemic. Hard to self-isolate when you're living 14 people to a 3-bedroom home. How much funding for housing do you think there needs to be?
Well, there are, you know, some wildly large sums of estimates. And as you know, the AFN recently commissioned a report on this very question. And the estimate that they received from the researchers was about $60 billion in a housing infrastructure gap. Now, I will say that not all of that could be done or completed immediately because, of course, there are other factors that delay or prevent people from adding houses in First Nations communities. But I know that many chiefs are talking about long waiting lists in communities. So, for example, if a community, you know, typical community may have anywhere between 30 to 100 households waiting in core housing need. So those are big gaps across the country, and each community is different. Each community has a different set of challenges or opportunities, but the message has been consistent just in terms of how many people are waiting on waiting lists to acquire units that are going to meet their needs.
As our Brett Forrester reported, Indigenous Affairs has asked Parliament to approve nearly $40 billion in funding. That would be making your department the top federal spender this year. If approved, well, where would this funding be going?
Well, I think what we're talking about, I think, are the supplementary estimates. And,
right.
And part of that money is to settle the CHRT lawsuit. As you know, there's a compensation piece and a system reform piece. And so part of that money is around compensation for people that suffered at the hands of discriminatory practices in child and family welfare services. But a lot of that is also on some pretty significant infrastructure needs and spans that the government has been conducting with First Nations communities over the last little bit. And so that is things like infrastructure that's needed for community functioning, like schools, community centers, some of the basic civil engineering that goes into subdivision development, and then obviously other expenses as it's related to COVID and the management of COVID.
There was some concern, some comments coming from that story that, and this isn't new, that a lot of this funding meant for programs and people ends up in the bureaucracy, a lot of it in the hands of lawyers. Is that a concern you share?
Well, I think, it's a generalization. Obviously, there will be legal fees on settlements, and lawyers will have, fees paid to them for the work that they've conducted on behalf of Indigenous people. But no, in terms of the department work on infrastructure, this is money that is distributed to communities for critical infrastructure needs that help improve the functioning of communities. There is also, as you know, some really great movement in terms of block funding and Indigenous communities that are, as you know, regaining control over child and family services through C92 that are, in the midst of funding agreements on child and family services that will be delivered by Indigenous communities. So, listen, it's a bit of a generalization to say it will all end up in the hands of lawyers. There will be legal fees associated with compensation, but much of the work the department does is directly with community.
Housing was one of the top items in the reconciliation part for the NDP there with the pact with your party. With this deal in place with the NDP and some certainty in the next few years, the next few budgets, what are you hoping can be accomplished?
Well, this is, I think, a real highlight for me as the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, is that the agreement that we have with the NDP is to focus systematically on housing, on First Nation, that is First Nations led and determined. And so the language is exactly right, and it really aligns with the federal government's perspective on infrastructure development and on community development that is First Nations led. It does give us, this agreement, a longer runway. We now will have a number of budgets to be able to stage that work. As I said, there is a huge gap, but communities are at different places in terms of being able to plan those builds and to be able to fit sometimes those builds onto existing pieces of land. And so there's many steps for some communities, and it gives us that time to work together to stay focused on closing that housing gap and supporting communities who have many steps in front of them in order to do that.
Action on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is another one of those items on the NDP's list there. The Chief Commissioner, Marion Buller, on this show a few weeks ago said the government has fallen flat on its face when it comes to implementing a plan. What's your reaction to the Chief Commissioner's comments?
Well, first, I just want to thank the Chief Commissioner for her work. I had the pleasure, as you know, years ago, being one of the ministers to launch the inquiry, and I highly respect the Chief Justice's perspective. I think that we have to act very quickly and strongly in all different realms. And of course, my colleague, Minister Miller, is, technically responsible for the implementation of the MMIW action plan. But as the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, much of the work in terms of some of those social determinants of health and wellness lie within my department. So we were just talking about housing. It's a critical ingredient in making sure that families and women have safe places to stay and have options about where they will stay. It's also about transforming child and family services and restoring control to Indigenous communities to care for their children and families in ways that are culturally appropriate. It's also about supporting communities with mental health and wellness and in programs that are designed by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. So there is lots of work happening across departments, and I would just say that I will be reflecting on her comments and looking for ways that I can more quickly implement the components that will help to create that safety and that base, if you will, of social determinants of health that protect families and children.
Minister, much more to talk about here. We just have to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Patty Hajdu, the Minister of Indigenous Services for the federal government. Minister, before the break, we were touching on the MMIWG final report action plan there. Commissioner Buller saying that she doesn't think that there is a plan out there. Are you concerned at all that these 231 calls for justice are going to sit on a shelf?
Well, I don't think it's fair to say that they're going to sit on the shelf, Dennis. I think, in fact, our government has been working on a number of aspects that are contained within those action items in the plan. I'll just point to, for example, the recent launch of consultations on co-developed policing legislation that would be obviously a framework for Indigenous communities who wish to have care and control over policing and enforcement in their own communities. This is something that many activists have been calling for a very long time, and I would say that is a step in the right direction in terms of returning autonomy and reducing the experience of racism and discrimination that many Indigenous people face at the hands of policing. We've also got a number of actions related to anti-racism, strategies, as well as the significant work that we're doing on removing and eliminating racism in the field of healthcare. Now, the question is it enough? And I will say that there is a lot of work ahead for partners at every level of government, and I'm looking forward to being an activist in this space with my colleague Minister Miller and many colleagues across government.
Now, you mentioned policing. I'd like to talk a bit about that. As you know, there's been a lot of reports, including from here, about Thunder Bay, your hometown, having at least 25 unsolved cases of MMIWG on the books there at the Thunder Bay Police Service. You've worked with vulnerable people in the community for many, many years. Is this something that you've heard about over the years as well?
Well, certainly as the former executive director of Shelter House, which, as you know, Dennis, is a large homeless shelter in Thunder Bay that services many Indigenous people, this is part of why I'm a federal politician. It was extremely alarming to see the experience of racism that many Indigenous people who used Shelter House services faced, not just through law enforcement interaction, but certainly through medical interaction with other service providers in the community. And it was really disheartening to see that happen in some cases day after day, and in particular to extremely vulnerable people. So I think the reckoning that's happening across the systems of care in Thunder Bay is entirely appropriate. It's something that I have maintained throughout my political career as a federal politician, that all systems and at all levels need to be not just talking about decolonizing and anti-racism efforts, but actually practically looking at how to amplify and accelerate that work. These are individuals that are suffering, as we speak every day in communities through discriminatory practices that prevent them from accessing care and services that every other citizen and community can access. And we all need to work harder to end that.
There are calls right now from First Nations leaders, family members, and others to disband the Thunder Bay Police Service. What are you hearing on that? Have you any thoughts on that? I know it's a provincial thing.
Yeah, I don't want to weigh into the mechanisms of the Thunder Bay Police. I will say this, though, that this has been an ongoing conversation for a very long time. And if Indigenous people in the community still feel that their needs are not being cared for in a way that's non-discriminatory, in a way that's safe, in a way that protects family members and protects them in their interactions with the Thunder Bay Police, then more needs to be done, and more needs to be done more quickly. It's been a decade at least since I started at the Thunder Bay Shelter House and saw for myself firsthand just how difficult it was for particularly Indigenous homeless people to receive care that was competent, that was kind, that was nonviolent in some cases. And so it is, this is a matter of life and death for Indigenous individuals in the community of Thunder Bay. But I will say again, this is not limited to work that the Thunder Bay Police Service has to do. This is really about all systems within, at all levels of government, that need to be looking thoughtfully about how we change the way that we interact with often very vulnerable citizens in our community.
And I guess for the federal government's way, what are you looking at to change that?
So this is the process of reconciliation and decolonization, and it is a large piece of work. Part of it is, as you know, the department has a mandate to close the socioeconomic gap by 2030, as well as a mandate to move as quickly as possible to positions of self-determination for Indigenous people. And so it is about co-developed legislation. It is about ensuring that there's equity in the federal budgets and how we spend our money, and how we make sure that that money is keeping up with the cost of living for First Nations communities. It's about ensuring that the projects that we embark on as a federal government have the lens of full economic participation of Indigenous people. So there's a lot of work to do, but a lot of that work is happening together with Indigenous organizations and NIOs.
And as you mentioned, your government recently launched an engagement process on First Nations policing. That's happening right now. Minister, we're running short on time, so just going to move to another big issue, and that's water. When you were first named Minister of Indigenous Affairs, boil water advisories, you said, was one of your main priorities. There were 44 at the time, and I think it's currently down to about 34. Some boil waters advisories ended this week. Are there new timelines, though, for when we're going to get all these communities clean drinking water?
Well, listen, I'm working with communities as we speak to understand what the barriers are to lift the remaining 34 boil water advisories. And we've come a long way, haven't we, since 2015. And I know that people are disappointed that we haven't been able to lift all of those boil water advisories. I'll say I'm disappointed as well, because I firmly believe that every person in this country deserves the right to access to clean drinking water. But we won't rest till we get this work done. And you're right. We anticipate that we'll have a number more lifted in the next 6 or 8 months. There are some that are in various stages of completion, and people can follow along online. I know that Canadians are very interested in this. We do have a web page that lists all remaining boil water advisories in the stage of work that those projects are in. I will also say that we've really heard the Parliamentary Budget Officer talk about the need to make sure that not only are we investing in the physical infrastructure of water treatment plants, but that we're also equitably funding operation and maintenance. And so now I'm pleased to say that we fund 100% of the costs of operation and maintenance for water treatment plants. And we're working on helping to amplify great ideas like the Atlantic Water Authority, that is about bringing groups together to provide some regional capacity to help support each other in terms of making sure that there's enough staff to continue to run treatment plants, that the training is ongoing, and that they have a center of excellence to be able to troubleshoot really challenging problems that water operators come up against.
Minister, again, much more to still discuss, but we do have to step aside for one more quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here with Patty Hajdu, the Minister of Indigenous Services. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Patty Hajdu, the Minister of Indigenous Services. Minister Hajdu, as we record this episode, Indigenous delegates are in Rome meeting with the Pope, searching for an apology, among other things, including documents. The Canadian government is still sitting on residential school documents. Do you see those all being handed over sometime in the near future?
Well, I know that's the commitment of my colleague, Minister Miller, that he will work tirelessly to root out documents and to be able to share those documents as they're uncovered within the federal government. And yes, I mean, that's the intention, and I know Minister Miller has been very clear about that.
And as you say, you know, this is Minister Miller's working on these things, but you're aware of them. Well, why do you think documents like this are so political and controversial and take so long to hand over?
Again, this not being in control of the file, I mean, I can tell you that Minister Miller is fully committed to finding those documents and turning them over when they're found. Part of the challenge is the documents can be very difficult to find. They can be in the annals of, history and boxes in warehouses. There's a physical aspect to locating those documents. But he's been very clear with all of us around the table that he expects full transparency on those documents as it relates to residential schools, and he certainly is a strong advocate to make sure that happens.
As our APTN News host, Nation to Nation, Brett Forrester, again, has been reporting, there's current and former government employees who are taking legal action against the Canadian government, alleging systemic racism in the federal Indigenous agencies and departments. Third-party reports found, quote, staggering racism at Indian Oil and Gas Canada. What's your reaction to what's been uncovered?
Well, thanks for the question, and it's such an important one, and it just highlights that no matter where people work, people who are Indigenous have experienced and are, in some cases, continuing to experience systemic and interpersonal racism in the workforce, and it's completely unacceptable. When I heard that report, I was horrified as well, and I spoke with my deputy to talk about how we could more rapidly make changes within our own department to create much better systems of safety for Indigenous employees. I have people that I work with closely that have worked within the department that have told me their own personal stories about how that systemic racism and that interpersonal racism affected them and traumatized them. This is extremely unacceptable, and we cannot expect to thrive as an organization, as a government, if people are in positions where they do not feel safe in the workplace. So I am examining with my deputy every avenue to more quickly accelerate systems that can protect people in the workplace and send a strong signal that there is zero tolerance for the experience of racism or creating systems of racism within the federal public service.
Well, we had one of the lead plaintiffs in the proposed class action on this show. We're taping this ahead of time. It'll actually air tonight. But she said Indigenous people should not bother working for the federal government. What's your message to Indigenous people out there that are looking for work with the federal government but worried when they hear these types of horror stories?
That's a hard one to answer, Dennis, because obviously that's an extremely personal experience that the individual that you're talking about has relayed to you. And I would say that I'm devastated that someone feels that this is so unsafe that she would recommend that Indigenous people not work for the federal government. But I'll also say this: we need Indigenous people working for the federal government. The federal government needs a diverse workforce with people who are Indigenous, with lived experience in their communities, in their part of the country, to be able to help shape the policies of our country going forward. And without their voices, without their perspective, without their input, our country will be poorer for it. And so my job as a minister is to make sure that I take those kinds of complaints seriously and that I push as hard as I can on the department that I'm responsible for and with my colleagues to question everything and to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to hold people to account, to hold departments to account, to create those safer workplaces for Indigenous people, because our country needs Indigenous people to work for this government. That is the only way forward as a country that is determined to reconcile and to create a country where everybody has a fair chance to succeed.
Minister, lots more we definitely could have touched on here, but we are out of time. But Minister Hajdu, appreciate you taking some of your time to be with us here this week on the show.
Thank you very much for the interview, Dennis. Take care in Thunder Bay next week.
Thanks. That is all the time we have for this week. You can catch up on any episode you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. This episode and all of our past episodes are also available as podcasts. You can find those at aptnnews.ca/face-to-face podcast. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for tuning in to Face to Face. Have a great night. We'll see you back here next week.